Hi, I'm Rumaan Alam. I'm a writer and contributing editor at the New Republic, and tonight is the third installment of our Summer Film Festival. And I'm very excited to be joined tonight by my colleague, Joe Livingstone, who's the staff critic at the New Republic. Joe was on leave for a period of time last year, and I got to fill in for their estimable shoes. It was very stressful, but really a wonderful opportunity. Joe is a critic I have long admired, and because of the absurd conditions under which we live now, we have not even met in person. But I'm very excited to have this conversation with Joe tonight. Tonight, we are talking about Bruno Dumont's 2013 film, Camille Claudel, 1915. And I can already tell that Joe is going to absolutely destroy me because they speak French. like every good European, Joe has some French, and so I think that I hope my pronunciation game is up to the task. But Joe, come off of mute and talk to me about this film.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting, and it's wonderful to actually speak to you.
I know.
I was so delighted when I found out that you were going to be covering for me while I was away, and we are actually on vacation very close to each other, so maybe we'll finally meet soon.
We'll finally get to meet in person.
But, this movie pick was just a sublime one, and such a joy to watch for me. Someone from our work told me that they thought it was kind of slow, but I found it totally hypnotic.
I can't believe you're not going to name names and say who, what cutthroat one of our colleagues didn't like this film. I mean, when I was designing this program with our colleague Kim, I was attracted to this film because I thought it sort of dramatized, or it seemed to metaphorize the way that we all feel right now. It's a film about a real woman who was an artist who was living in forced isolation inside of an asylum. We're all kind of living in this sort of period of forced isolation, some to more degrees than others. And being the one sane person inside of an asylum seems to describe the political reality in which we find ourselves. Like, I'm sane, but everyone around me is crazy, or I don't understand, like the world is not operating according to logic. So that was the initial attraction of the film. But of course, it's a fascinating document of a real life, and it's much more interesting than just as a metaphor for how we feel right now. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's true in this movie, or what this movie shows us?
Sure. I think the fact that you're flagging from the beginning that madness is both a kind of figurative theme in the film and also a very literal part of Camille Claudel's life, and one that the movie doesn't deny. So Camille was a very, very talented young sculptor who was born in the 1860s, and when she was 19, she became a student of Rodin's, a student of sculpture, and she it very quickly became obvious that she was extremely talented. She joined his studio. It's possible that they even made that her fingerprints are on some of his sculptures, very, very literally. Yeah. People have done kind of surface scanning to try and figure that out. But she made a number of sculptures which were deemed risque, a little outre, very, very expressive human figures. It's kind of her signature. But what we see in the movie is the aftermath of what happened to her after the break with Rodin, who never left his wife, despite the fact that Camille drew up a contract and he made him sign it saying that he would, but he never left his partner. And her brother and her mother had her essentially committed to this facility run by nuns, a convent-based medical facility, essentially, where, as we also see towards the end of the movie, the staff didn't think that she should be living. And Camille campaigned for, I think she was in the asylum for something around 30 years. She campaigned for her own release and was never successful. And, her reputation really died out with her. As I mentioned, her sculptures, the waltz is a famous one, are very, very erotic, very sensual, and they also quite clearly pertain to her own erotic life and romantic life and imaginary life, which is so bound up with Rodin and then with paranoia around Rodin and his friends, and that phrase Rodin and his gang that
Mm-hmm.
comes up in the movie a lot, also comes up in her letters. And that's a real delusion that she appeared to experience. And that's one of my favorite things about the movie, how closely it treads that line between almost trying to present her as redeemably sane, but also
Well,
someone whose imagination just goes there.
but I mean, I think that is what the movie complicates, is that definition of sanity, because if she is somebody who was promised a romantic life with this man who then changed his mind or didn't uphold his bargain, she's not wrong to feel betrayed, or she's not wrong to feel like, well, reality is shifting in front of me. The way that manifests in the film, we see early on, she has sort of special dispensation to prepare her own meals because she's afraid of being poisoned. And so clearly that's a different level of paranoia, but it's whatever that paranoia is, it is rooted in the incredible betrayal of a seemingly sane person being among people who are profoundly ill. All of the other performers in the film, all the other inmates in the asylum, are quite ill in ways that the filmmaker Bruno Dumont uses quite beautifully, I think. But it's very unsettling to watch.
Her relationship with the other people who live at this facility is one of the most complicated and I think kind of beautiful aspects of the movie. My favorite scene, I think, is the one in which she's watching two people rehearse for a production of what is it, Don Juan?
Don Juan.
Yeah, and or Don Juan is the Byron version or whatever. I don't know. And how she goes from first being so charmed by their version of mimesis, right? The kind of spin on the way that their mistakes introduce this kind of aleatory joy into the staging. And then once it gets too close to the themes of her own delusion, right? By speaking about betrayal, when he says, I would never betray you, I love you too much. I love you de trop, right? And then she just bursts into tears, and then you get Juliette Binoche crying in a church, which is just, that's my ideal form of editing. Sorry, to go back to the other people, I actually hadn't thought about her condition relative to the people around her.
The madness that they seem to be enacting is much more apparent. Like Juliette Binoche, a beautiful, like a gorgeous woman who is playing somebody, in the grips of sort of madness or imprisonment, really. The other performers they have physical deformity, they have like very obvious mental tics. They're doing things that indicates that they're profoundly ill. And there seems to be some distinction being drawn between the sort of like the outward presentation of madness and the sort of the inward, what it is to be mad sort of inside. But I also love this moment where she finds this second of joy watching a performance, because I think it suggests inside the film that art is still some kind of salvation for this person, that she was an artist and she finds this moment of art. There's also a moment where she's out for a walk and she starts playing with some clay that she's found on the ground. And just the suggestion that she was an artist at her core, and that was the one sane thing left inside of her.
Camille Claudel was she was obsessed with sand and soil as a little kid. Has this very kind of deep-rooted part of her artistic imagination was related to the landscape and to the material qualities of the landscape, which is, maybe this is a whole separate part of the conversation to talk about the cinematography and about but I just love the way that Dumont has treated the natural materials in the movie. That white stone, the black horse, amazing. But just to go back to the other cast members, it's interesting because, right, as you say, the majority of the other people there are physically disabled in some way, or they seem to behave in ways that other people have clearly either sort of rejected or thought they need help within this closed facility that can't be given to them at home, right?
Yeah.
And Camille's condition, right, it's also subjectively defined. It's just defined by her brother, who's a total fanatic, and her mother, who doesn't seem to have been very nice either. So I think in a way, you know, there are lots of people, you know, we don't ask disabled people to live separately from other people anymore, right? And we also don't ask that of the mentally ill, because that's just been a total paradigm shift within the way that we medicalize behavior, right? Medicalize the way that we behave, and on all different levels, and how we communicate. So in a way, I think that it's helpful for the movie's project, because it helps us to think about the way that Camille's situation is entirely the result of other people's perception of her aberrance, right? Of her kind of anomalousness, and which is also her career flopped.
Right. But the movie also doesn't like provide the audience with really enough information. So the audience is kind of asked to diagnose whether or not you see her as mad or unjustly confined. And the movie doesn't really provide you with any information. You just have to kind of you have to confront it and sit with the discomfort of not really understanding whether she was paranoid and feared that her food was being poisoned, or whether she was sensitive, or whether she was just sort of, you know, she had this sort of artistic temperament, and that's, you know, or whether any woman in such circumstances would not also feel absolutely mad, you know?
I think in some ways, I felt that about everybody who was living at the facility, including the nuns.
Yes.
Like, you know, like how much has everybody who lives here chosen to be here? Or how, and to what extent are they simply, you know, the remnants of society who are, you know, it's easy to just put them out of sight and to continue and not just even think about it. But it was very helpful for me at the end of the movie when the director of the facility says to Paul how bored she is, because that made me realize that if this is a woman who's so passionately attached to the material of sculpture, of landscape, of that, by the time she was 19, she was basically, you know, on her way to becoming a famous artist, then not being able to create is enough to make you, you know, to kind of like trap you in a kind of feedback loop that resembles madness, and also, you know, madness itself, what is it?
Yeah, I guess that's the bigger question, is like, who's to say? Because in the third act of the film, we do meet Camille's brother, Paul. And Paul his feeling about his sister, or his choice, or his feeling that his sister needs to be in this place, that she is, I don't know actually that he articulates why that is, but he speaks about his own faith in that moment. And he's speaking to a priest, and the priest, so they're having a conversation about God and responsibility and sort of morality. And of course, what happens is that they are the ones who sound crazy. So in this conversation, they sound absolutely crazy. And then when he goes to the asylum to see his sister, her response to him is to run and hug him because she's feeling so isolated, and she knows that he is her salvation. And his response seems like, she seems like the sane one in this exchange. And it's a remarkable way that the power sort of changes.
I think, but let's try and rephrase it, right? Like, what work there are the words crazy and sane doing, right? Like, what is it exactly that makes him seem pathological and her seem well-regulated in comparison?
His conviction is so related to something that's understood to possess power, right? Like, he's talking about, you know, a sense of divine mission, and that is understood by the people he's talking to in a way that her sense of her life's mission doesn't compute in the same way. It's not even in the same language.
I loved the part where he was protesting to the priest about how he takes no pleasure in his
Yes.
mysticism,
Yeah.
that this engagement with God has been, it's a passively received gift that has nothing to do with the senses. It's, and even though we see him in this sort of physical ecstasy while he's writing letters in his room, we see him in this kind of beside himself at like something to do with his own body, some kind of experience that is happening, which is clearly deeply physical. He's obviously getting off on it on some level, right? Like it's a pleasurable thing for him in a way that seems to make him so uncomfortable that he is engaged on a kind of anti-pleasure crusade, right? And in the form of, okay, well, let me, and it takes the form of confining his sister, who, has been publicly associated with sex and art, right? And not just sex and art, but the expressive representations of sex,
of the body,
right? Expressive representations of the body, right? And by contrast, Paul Claudel's writing, he's kind of best known for his symbolist plays, which are, mostly, they're about heroic men overcoming temptation. And they're very allegorical. They're very much about two fixed meanings translating into one another. It's a completely different concept of what it is to, make a text or a work of art and put it out there into the world.
But it is funny because, as you say, there's this scene where he's writing a letter and he's half dressed, he's not wearing a shirt, and it is almost this depiction of the body in ecstasy from somebody whose quest or whose motivation is so spiritual. Like it's like looking at the depictions of ecstasy in religious painting, and it's just funny or ironic that he is doing he's embodying something that his sister's work would have captured, but in a different way.
Right, and the Catholicism allows him, or at least the rhetoric of Catholicism, the way that he deploys it, allows him to be in a very specific form of denial.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Which seems so importantly related to sexuality that, this story, it's like, it's just one of those cases from history that was just like wrapped up in a bow and handed to Michel Foucault to to prove all his points about what it means when we stigmatize and regulate sexual life in any way, but especially when it comes to the expressive arts, how much it can bend us,
Yeah. I mentioned this to you earlier, but I just so happened to be reading Celia Paul's forthcoming memoir, Self-Portrait, and she mentions Camille Claudel. And I know that Camille is a very particular touchstone for a lot of artists, especially artists who are women. I wonder if you have a sense of sort of what the mythology is about this story, like how this story, what it's come to mean to people, or how people distill it down into sort of a morality tale.
I couldn't pretend to say in literary terms, and I'm really interested. Maybe you can say more about the way that Celia Paul writes about her, but there's a strong narrative around her of the forgotten, the woman whose career and legacy was obliterated by men and then reclaimed by us enlightened modern people. I think I only came across her work when they opened a museum in her hometown devoted to her. And the headlines were great. It's a perfect story, long forgotten, also beautiful. She was famously very, very beautiful. Long forgotten genius artist, eclipsed by boyfriend, rejoins culture, right? And we have a lot of those. I think that itself is an interesting sort of story that's been glued onto her story. I'm sort of interested in the concept of rediscovering the female work, especially because so many rediscovered women's art has to do with what has been considered pathological or wrong in the past, right?
Yes, or that there's a sense like that the reason that they require rediscovery is because the career was curtailed by some other force. And so it's easy to look back with a sense of almost smug enlightenment, as you say, and say, like, well, now we see more clearly. But at the same time, the work, so I'm thinking of this happens with writers. I feel like this happens like every 2 decades. There's a writer, it's always a woman. Like Bet Howland is a woman who I think this is happening for right now. And revisiting her work and saying she didn't get her due because she had a relationship with Saul Bellow, or because she died by suicide, or because all these other factors. It's very hard to know if you're doing the work a disservice by only seeing it in terms of it's sort of as like a the triumph of like a contemporary perspective on that, you know, and it's like the work also arose from those conditions, so you can't divorce it from those conditions. So it gets very tangled up. It gets really confused. And I feel like we allow ourselves to be very smug as though 1970 was 1870, and it wasn't, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a heroic narrative all of its own,
Yeah.
exploiting and rescuing, like
Yeah.
rescuing this art, or kind of victim of art history, victim
Yeah.
of patriarchal art history. And it makes us do all kinds of strange things, you know. This is something that in my kind of former academic field, medieval literature, is we come across a lot because of how close a lot of religious narratives, especially around mysticism, which has a strong role to play in this movie, how pathologized ecstatic and mystical behavior has been by the, like, you know, Western medicine over the last couple of centuries. So, you know, when the Book of Marjorie Kemp, which is an autobiography of someone from the 15th century, was kind of, when we read that today, people want to say, this woman suffered from XYZ mental conditions, and that's why she did what she did, and that's how she expressed what she expressed. And it's actually a very anti-art, I think, kind of way of reading things. I mean, I'm all for historicism when it's appropriate.
Well, I think
for the historian kind of
it becomes very complicated. I think you see this a lot with gender right now, right? Where there's a tendency to reframe earlier queer existence through the language of contemporary queer existence, and they don't always fit comfortably together, right? They just don't always add up. And to say of somebody who never said of themselves that they were a trans person or that they were a non-binary person, you know, diagnosing somebody using terminology or language or circumstance that we only understand in this moment isn't always accurate or fair.
I think it's not just inaccurate and unfair, it's domineering, it's anachronistic.
Yeah.
And it's not something that we expect of living artists.
Yeah.
To explain the relationship between, you know, what's wrong with them and what's right with them.
Yeah.
It's not something that we expect. So
yeah.
Just to go back to Camille Claudel, right? This is a film made by a very decorated film director who is, you know, in some way, I guess you could say, oh, he profited from her life story. I mean, that itself is a reductive reading, but
yeah.
You know, it's not, the story is always going to have to be deployed in the world by a storyteller.
Yeah.
And tell me about what Celia Paul says. I want to, you know, I want to feel good about reviving her.
It's salient, I think, in this book because Paul is writing so much about her relationship with Lucian Freud and trying to establish what her sense of self was in the context of a romantic relationship with this man, this very great man, this sort of outsized great man. And in the book, she very persuasively talks about her influence on his work, that a composition that she created for a family portrait that he was so struck by that he then wanted to do the same thing, and that she sat for that painting, or that he was just so taken by some of the choices that she made as an artist that he, you know, as all artists do, artists are sort of all rapacious vultures. And so that's sort of how it works. And when that is intertwined with a romantic relationship, that's one complication. Lucian Freud was quite a bit older than Celia Paul, so that's another complication. They had a child together. Like, there are many sort of complicating factors. And so the power dynamic that you see is probably not dissimilar from the one that existed between Camille Claudel and Rodin. And so it makes sense that that would be a touchstone for Celia Paul. But I do feel like I've heard, this is a name that you hear, I'm like so on summer vacation mode that I don't have like all of the other, like there are just certain kinds of touchstones who you bring up when you want to talk about this kind of stuff, like the difficulty of negotiating professional career as an artist with being a woman, right? And there are all these cautionary tales that come up, and I feel like this is one, and this is maybe the oldest one, because she is, you know, she died in the 1940s, but as you said, she was born in the 19th century.
Oh, no way. I don't think that she's the oldest one. I think that they go back as far as literature. I think it goes back as far to like Sappho.
Maybe, right. Maybe I guess what's more accurate to say is that we would have expected better of somebody who was still alive in the 20th century, even though I did just say like that Helen was alive in the 1970s, but like that we sort of think that the standard has gotten better for what we allow women to do. And, you know.
Well, I think the movie also, for me, it felt also like an invitation to think about the extent to which, you know, a lot of disabled people are still, you know, people placed in facilities by families who like can't care for them, or people, others, you know, find it difficult to make alternative arrangements and go for an option that like might not actually be best for their family because of other constraints. So it's, you know, the movie is provocative in terms of thinking about what has not changed in terms,
yes.
you know,
yes.
of what we accept as part of the texture of public life.
Yes, 100%. Not just in terms of what an artist is allowed to do, but in terms of like, what is illness, or what do we do with a person who doesn't adhere to the rules that, as we understand them? Where can we send them? If we don't have picturesque buildings in the French countryside full of nuns to take care of them, like what are we going to do with them?
And I think this question pertains to art in a way, because I think that in the movie, Dumont stages these scenes where you see art without an author happening, art without an artist, right?
Yes.
Like I'm thinking about the staging scene, and also these beautiful, I thought very beautiful moments of friendship between Camille and the other residents.
Yes.
Yes. Even though sometimes she's, you know, like petty and bitchy and says horrible things about them, you know, she's also a human being who sees that she has a certain responsibility to the people around her. Even though she's, you know, she's a big monster artist, she finds, the movie finds a way to show these little moments between people. Now I'm thinking about it, whether kind of like on the stage or in just kind of like the daily interactions between people. I mean, the whole thing's so stylized. Like nuns' outfits are so stylized. You know, everyone who lives there dresses in black. They live in a house of like gleaming white stone. You know? It's like
a Bottega Veneta catalog or something like that. Like everybody looks incredibly chic. Like even when she, in the beginning, when Camilla's getting dressed, I was like, what is she wearing? She looks amazing. And there's a scene at the very beginning where she asks to go sit outside and eat her meal. And she goes outside and she's wearing a sort of long black skirt. And I was like, she looks like Georgia O'Keeffe. It's exactly how I picture Georgia O'Keeffe, like incredibly chic, like perfect, like modern clothes, sitting outside in her courtyard, her adobe courtyard in, you know, New Mexico.
But not free, right?
Right, but imprisoned, yes.
I'm thinking.
There's something, I wonder if you had this experience, but there's something to me that is almost pleasant about the conditions in which she's depicted. And I, like, because it's so beautiful, because it's so stylized, as you say, there's a scene where they're where all of the patients are playing with a xylophone and one is sort of plunking on the piano, and because of the costuming, because of the way it all looks, it's very chic, and it made a kind of stoic commitment to the self seem really beautiful, and like it made me want to go stay in a French monastery, not against my will and not for 4 decades, but it's almost like how the world's most beautiful artist retreat would run.
That's so funny. Right, the idea of the retreat as a retreat into the self that could be facilitated by being pushed to the edge of society.
Yeah.
Right? It's a double-edged sword, being when the world defines you as different, right, like differently abled, then you become exempt from the requirements of otherwise participating, right? And then you also lose everything that comes along with having those kind of obligations, you know, and to other people. I've forgotten what I was going to say next. Wait, what is... Oh yeah, I was gonna, the idea of the artist retreat. That's so interesting. To me, it really seemed like Camille is living out a fantasy life for Paul, right?
Mm.
Paul Claudel in real life was a diplomat who lived in China for a long time and traveled the world and was a very, very worldly person. And in a way, you know, by putting his sister in a convent and forcing her into this type of intense reflection, he's almost sort of sentenced her to the life of a literary mystic, right?
Yeah.
Women renouncing society in order to join kind of monogendered, sealed communities is it's a gesture and an act with a long, long, rich intellectual tradition behind it. And yet Paul has no interest in doing that for himself.
God, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah.
It's almost as if he wants to be of the old Catholic tradition and break away from it. There's something very, very kind of modernist about that to me. Can we talk about the way the movie looks?
Yes, let's talk about it. It's a very stylish movie.
It is. What was your favorite bit of landscape?
Well, there's a scene where they go for a stroll. She says, one of the nuns says, "Let's go for our walk," and you hear the tread of these shoes on rock as this band of patients is marching up to a sort of precipice. And I thought that was really striking. I thought the way that you could hear the wind was really beautiful. I thought the way that you could hear the rock was really beautiful. And it's a very severe landscape, but quite beautiful. And again, I was thinking so much of Georgia O'Keeffe, and I was thinking of that sort of severe New Mexican territory that really did something for her artistically, sort of liberated her artistically.
Oh, interesting. Not working, right? Well, she is. You're right. You mentioned that point where she kind of just can't seem to resist the earth.
Yeah. But she also, one of the things that she says that's so heartbreaking to me, when her brother visits and she finally kind of like has the opportunity to weigh all, like just sort of get all of her grievances out, the thing that she says that she misses is the studio, which I thought was very striking. I miss my studio, this idea that like men had come into her studio and taken her work, that she had this sort of sacred space. She's trapped in a space that is literally sacred in this, convent, but she doesn't have that sort of room of one's own. She doesn't have like her actual liberty, the thing that space represented for her.
I did think of a room of one's own as well, because Woolf is so clever about explaining that privacy within one's own home is actually a luxury of being part of things.
Yes.
You are going to be the only people who get to live by themselves are people who are full humans in their own right and can participate in, the economies of humanity. And that's precisely what Camille desires and can't have.
She even says something about her cats, like, you thought I was... Do you remember that?
She said, "What was my crime? Living alone, spending my life with cats."
Which is incredible because it's like, oh, the notion of like the cat lady is such a like, that's so, you know, it seems like something from Kathy cartoons from the 1980s, but in fact it sort of goes back. There's clearly a longer tradition there. There's a longer history there.
Well, you know, it does make me think more about Paris in the, you know, early decades of the 20th century, right? This is a place where, you know, a small but significant number of women intellectuals are making the, you know, making their impression. Also expats, right? We have a lot of American women finding independence, and I can't imagine what it would have been like to, you know, to be a part of that Paris.
Yeah.
And to be a part of that artistic community, which really was, you know, quite a special historical confluence of forces, and then to lose it, and to thrust back into the condition of childhood, right? Because I think she was educated at a convent as well. Oh, we've been reminded to ask people about questions.
Oh yes, if people have questions to ask, jump in. I hope that we are selling this film to people who might not have seen it, because as you say, I just think it is a very, as a film itself, as like a work of film, it's quite beautiful. It's beautiful to look at. It's really beautiful to listen to. There's a lot of silence in this movie, and I don't remember there being a lot of score, but there's a lot of sort of like ambient sound that becomes really part of the texture of being in this place, even if it's just sort of the other patients' weird vocalizations or the sound of their feet through the rocks. What were your favorite cinematic gestures in this work?
I agree. I love the sound. The sound is very good on her voice, right? On Juliette Binoche's. She has just fantastic range. I mean, the sounds that she's capable of making are just ferocious. But she does a lot of good gulping, a lot of good sobbing, a lot of good. She makes a lot of kind of non-verbal sounds, and there's a way. There's a little bit of voyeurism in the movie, but there's an intimacy with her that I think that the sound plays really well into. The landscape just totally blew me away, right? The extremities of the pale sand, of the pines, of the sublime of the landscape, which Paul obviously relates to in a very straightforward religious way, right? When he's surveying the land, but she doesn't seem accessible to her.
Joe, I wonder if you could talk about what your book is about and whether you feel like it relates to this. Like, it's something that I thought of after I was watching the film. I was like, well, I think this is not that far from what you are engaged in thinking about as a writer.
Thanks for that.
Pre-order Joe's book, all of which. So.
I'm working on a book about women's mystical literature from roughly around the medieval period and into the early modern period in continental Europe, and I'm particularly interested in the ways in which physical seclusion and almost sort of a tendency towards self-abnegation and asceticism among women intellectuals of the medieval period seem to facilitate extremely juicy, sexualized, mystical experiences in private. But the key for me about the best writers from seclusion, or writers who secluded themselves and then wrote from that condition. I mean, these are very important male authors, Boethius, Augustine. They wrote that way too. But for women, it seems so importantly related to the choice, right? I've chosen to deprive myself of worldly freedom, and therefore I can be liberated somehow in my imagination. And this is completely not the case with Camille, right? And so it's a really actually quite delicate and perfect inversion of that trope.
Because it's an imprisonment as opposed to sort of giving yourself over to.
Yeah, and I think because sculpture doesn't seem to be something, at least the way the movie has it, that sculpture isn't something that you can reach by turning inward, right? And her work was so importantly about relationships and about gesture and about touch that and we never get to see any of her work in the movie because this is not a world in which sculpture can be.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, it bears upon a lot of different ideas about like privacy and where the best place for the artistic imagination to go is. But yeah.
I mean, again, as I said, I mean, I watched it with some feeling of yearning for not imprisonment, but liberty, the liberty of that space, or that, like, you know, the ability to sort of be apart from the rest of the world is kind of tantalizing. It's horrific the way it's depicted in this film. But again, I was thinking of Georgia O'Keeffe or Agnes Martin, or artists who really have simply chosen to chuck it all and enjoy that kind of liberty, you know.
So we have a question about Paul. So we have a question saying that Paul seems to think it's Camille's only way to salvation. Is Paul's confinement of his sister ultimately a condemnation, or does he have altruistic motives as well?
I think it's very hard for me to see. To me, the depiction that we see in this film feels not altruistic. It feels to me like the film is suggesting that the delusional one in this dynamic is not Camille, but Paul, and that he is the one who possesses the power over her to actually to do something to her, and that so he's operating not, I mean, he may be operating in good faith, but he's doing something cruel. I feel like that is what the film is suggesting, and I don't know why I think that, but maybe it's just my gut response to seeing a man imprison a woman.
I think you're right. I mean, I think it comes out of the direction, you know, the acting. It seems like these are the guy who plays, I'm not sure what his name is, the guy who plays Paul Claudel looks really eerily like the real dude. We should talk a little more about Juliette Binoche. I mean,
oh man,
I think the way that those two actors, you know, like the way that Dumont has directed, the way that they occupy space, there's a lot of very, very beautiful choreography inside enclosed spaces, whether it's the courtyard, the bedroom, the kitchen. Dumont has done something quite special, I think, with especially with depth, people standing further away,
yes.
people standing closer.
Yeah.
But yeah, just talk to me about Juliette Binoche.
Well, I mean, this is one of those films where one performance is just, the camera is on her basically the entire time, the entirety of the film. And sometimes it is quite like on her, really close. Other times it's sort of these beautiful tableau of, as you say, forms and figures moving in space in a way that feels very choreographed or very painterly almost. I said to you right before we started talking that one of the things I was so amused by or sort of tickled by thinking about was the last performance I had seen Juliette Binoche give was in High Life, which is a movie that I loved, and that's a performance that she delivers in English. And this film, she delivers a performance in French. And I wondered if there was a distinction for the performer, or whether there's, you know, I don't know if there is. I don't know why that occurred to me, but this performance is very intense. It's very difficult to watch. You're watching somebody, it's almost like a Lars von Trier film. You're watching a woman squirm under the eye of the camera and under these sort of stifling conditions. And you're hearing, as you said, you hear a lot of her you hear her making noises that are not words. Like you hear her, one of the first things you hear her doing is chewing in this way that feels very like vulnerable and kind of upsetting. And then she weeps, but the way that she weeps is very like, she's really racked with something. And performance is always kind of remarkable to me because I just can't imagine what is actually happening in the mind of Juliette Binoche, a woman alive in this moment, pretending to be somebody else in front of a camera. Like, it's just very hard for me to imagine what that is. But And so, you know, like when I think a performance is good, I never even really know how to sort of talk about why I think it's good.
Yeah, I mean, we have another question from the Q&A asking us to talk more about Dumont, which is a shame. We would like to confess that neither of us know very much about this guy.
I don't,
He's won the Palme d'Or, right?
Twice. He's won it twice. And he, or not the Palme d'Or, but the Grand Prix. I mean, this is clearly a film made with a lot of directorial conviction. He clearly had a very strong idea about how the story was going to be told and the suite of tools he was going to use to tell it. And I think one of the biggest ones is just Juliette Binoche, like unleashing her on camera and just sort of letting it happen. But what she does on camera, I found I don't know if you saw a film that came out last year called The Assistant, with Julia Garner, about a young woman who works in a production office, and she works for like a Harvey Weinstein type.
I saw the trailer, like I got the promo, and I was like, I can't take it.
It's very difficult to watch. It's very difficult to watch. But I thought about that movie watching this movie, because they're not dissimilar, where the camera is only interested in this one performer. She's in basically every aspect. She's in almost every shot of the movie, and sometimes she feels like she's a flat image in a larger construction, and other times she feels like she's a human being, and she doesn't say a lot, but you see her sort of breathing or pouring her cereal, and you hear her eating it. And a lot of that intimate business reminded me of this film, where it establishes this very tight rapport with somebody just by watching them eat, or just by watching them breathe, or watching them be. And they're both kind of women who are imprisoned, so it's very difficult.
Sorry, I muted myself. Can you hear the helicopter going past?
I can hear it over my house too.
Damn, what was I going to say? The helicopter interrupted me. Oh, Juliette Binoche's skill with crying. I would say this is a skill that also Isabelle Huppert has in spades, which is the ability to cry aggressively. Right? There's something about the way that Julie Binoche can cry, and it makes me think of the Three Colors trilogy, especially her kind of like white hot performance.
Yeah.
In that, where it's a grief that comes out of the rage of deprivation in that film, and also in this one, that she's just really, I think, no one else can touch her for that. But what I mean is expressing things other than sadness while crying.
Yes, that Camille is, she is oppressed in a very literal sense. She is sort of imprisoned. But her response to it is not just sadness or sorrow or hopelessness. She's furious. And when she switches from a kind of placid, as a patient in this facility, she ends up taking on some of the caregiving. So you see the nuns repeatedly asking her to watch over some of her fellow patients because she has a kind of higher level of competency. And so you see her shift from these moments of being quite sweet with these other women to being furious at them and screaming at them and saying, like, I don't want you here, go away. And as you say, she's crying, but it's not like it's tears that can convey a lot more than just I'm sad,
I think she seems to switch in and out of identification with the people around her, right? Because she clearly has, pretty advanced relationships with the other patients, right? Because they live together. And yet she has these moments of, even when she's kind of cruelly rejecting them, though, it almost seems like just one step more in their relationship. I thought those relationships were beautifully done.
They're hard to figure out. They're hard to summarize. And there's one patient in particular, Mademoiselle Lucas, the woman with the short dark hair, who seems like,
wonderful.
I loved her performance, and they seem like there's a suggestion of some special thing that exists between the two of them. And in the way that I suppose if you I suppose you would have, if you were both inmates, that you would bond over that in some fashion, you know.
Absolutely. And I think because, she's not an idiot. She can see the way in which she resembles the people around her, who have physical disabilities. And especially as somebody whose subject was always the human body.
Yeah.
I guess I hadn't really thought about that until now. I do think there's got to be something about disability representation in the arts, her being interested in the body transforming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wish we had another hour and a half.
do you feel like there's a do you feel like this there do you feel like this is so when I mentioned Celia Paul, I feel like Celia Paul is using the story as like a tidy morality fable about what has happened to her. Do you feel like we can do that with the story of Camille Claudel? Or do you feel like that's reductive, or do you feel like that's doing a disservice to history?
When you were talking before about, for example, when contemporary queer culture will claim somebody from the past and say, well, they were one of us. That, to me, it's almost a kind of like necromancy, right?
Yeah.
It's a very imposing gesture. It's also basically just conscripting somebody else's existence for your own rhetorical ends. She was a real person, and when you invoke people for purposes not really of political solidarity, but in order to make your point more effectively, then you're treating people like data, and I just think it's sort of unfair, which is maybe a stupid thing for someone who was once a historian to think. But
or is it because you are an historian and you feel like it's more about looking at a person in sort of the full context of their personhood and not reducing them to an anecdote or a cautionary tale?
I think that's absolutely right, and that the historicist way of seeing art made from a long time ago should never just be about recognizing the constraints upon that person, but also must always be about recovering what kind of capaciousness or difference or other types of knowledge that they had access to that we don't.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's very difficult to do with this film because, of course, we don't see her work, and so we don't have access to like the gift or the evidence, the tangible evidence of the genius. You sort of have to take it on faith, and that's why the film is sort of complicated to watch.
And there are maybe things that Camille Claudel was able to imagine, ways in which she could have been able to express herself, which Bruno Dumont will never understand.
Yeah, and maybe he chose not to wade into that because he knew he wouldn't understand it. Like, there's a way that you could say, well, maybe he knew that he couldn't really crack what was her genius, and so he's just trying to depict the circumstances of her story, And I do think there's value. I don't want to cheapen her existence by reducing it to anecdote, but I do feel like it's not an unfair leap to say previous generations did not treat women fairly. And this is an example of a woman who was treated quite unfairly and into the modern era. Like she died in 1946, like into a point in our history that feels uncomfortably close.
So tell me why, well, there's a little bit in the blurb for this festival about why you've chosen these movies, but can you maybe, bring us back around to the present moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of isolation or the sense of imprisonment, just a lot of people, right? Like this happened to Ellen DeGeneres, right? Like didn't Ellen DeGeneres say that she, being in her multi-million-dollar home was akin to being in prison, and she got a lot of flack for that, right? But we are all kind of using the language of imprisonment or feeling trapped in a way that's unfair, because we are, yes, we're not meant to leave our homes, and I understand that, but I'm talking to you right now via technology. Like, it's not fair to say that we are imprisoned. Like, that's a language that belongs to people who are actually imprisoned. And so this film was of interest to me because it depicts that, and it depicts it in like its in its actual horror. Like, it's quite frightening to watch this woman wander about this absolutely beautiful place that you know she can't leave. And that's very different from how we are in this moment.
I think that's so helpful because, you know, your mention of the way we are abusing the vocabulary of incarceration is interesting, because at the very same moment, you know, America is well into experiencing a moment of reckoning with law enforcement, with the, you know, systemic inequality and incarceration, and, you know, underpinning the whole kit and caboodle. So that, right, like there's kind of only one definition of freedom, but there are a lot of different ways to not be free.
Yes. And it must feel the way that it feels for Camille Claudel is the way that it feels for like the toddler imprisoned on the American border right now. And it is the way that it feels for like the human beings imprisoned in our sort of mega prisons all over the country, who nobody seems to give a shit if they get COVID-19 and perish. Like, every person has an interior life. And so, you know, as you said before, like, it's uncomfortable to acknowledge that like we don't actually have a good working definition of like what makes someone ill, what makes someone paranoid, like where is that line and who is deciding where that line is.
And it's relativistic, right? Which is what the movie reminds us. And, you know, gaslighting is somewhat of an overloaded term now in the discourse, but I've really loved the way that gaslighting has become a question of almost public health, you know, under the Trump administration. And this movie is about the, you know, like the purest form of being, you know, being told you're insane and so you don't matter. And that way, you know, like that rhetorical way that conservatives have of, you know, setting up the world so that anything you have to say against them sounds,
yes, you can't make any argument.
I mean that relevant, sadly relevant.
Yes, I mean, I think it's unlikely, maybe, if you understand this film as a biopic, but I do feel like it is a relevant text, and I'm really happy that I got a chance to watch it, and I'm really happy I got a chance to talk to you about it for an hour.
Thank you.
Again, we've been talking about Bruno Dumont's film, Camille Claudel, 1915. Highly recommend it. Not necessarily the kind of movie you think about going away on a beach vacation and watching, but that's exactly what I did, and I had a great time. So I don't know which one of our colleagues said that they found this movie slow, but that person is wrong. And our Summer Film Festival will continue next Tuesday, will be our last session. I'm going to speak to the critic Kyle Chayka, and we're going to talk to Matthew Prinzing, who is one of the directors of The Gates, which is the Maysles brothers film, which documents Christo and Jean-Claude installing the gates in Central Park. And it is such a beautiful, joyous film. One of the things I'm missing so much right now, Joe, is just art generally. And so, and especially a sense of like the public. And Christo and Jean-Claude's work, of course, is about public art. It's about like a gift to the people. And The Gates, if you haven't seen it, is an extraordinary film. So next Tuesday, I'm going to talk to Kyle and Matthew Prinzing about The Gates. This was so much fun. Enjoy the rest of your holiday. I will dream about being in a French monastery tonight.
Oh, wonderful. See you on the beach.
Take care. Bye.